When people hear about MS-13, they imagine a brutal gang machetes, tattoos, and violence stretching from Los Angeles to El Salvador. But behind every empire, there's an architect. One man helped transform a desperate group of Salvadoran immigrants into America's most feared gang. His name is César Humberto López Larios, but on the streets they call him El Greñas. From his early days as a refugee in Los Angeles to his rise as a founding leader of MS-13's Ranfla Nacional, the gang's ruling council El Greñas became more than just a gangster. He was a strategist, a shot caller, and one of the masterminds who turned MS-13 into a global criminal force. This isn't just the story of a man. This is the story of how El Greñas helped create the monster we know today as MS-13. Stay tuned, because once you step inside his world, you'll see why El Greñas is remembered not just as a gang member, but as one of the founders of America's most dangerous gang. The story of César Humberto López Larios, better known as El Greñas, begins long before his name carried fear across 2 continents. His journey is tied to the violent history of El Salvador, a country torn apart by one of the bloodiest civil wars in Latin America. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, El Salvador was a land of broken families and shattered communities. When people hear about MS-13, they imagine a brutal gang machetes, tattoos, and violence stretching from Los Angeles to El Salvador. But behind every empire, there's an architect. One man helped transform a desperate group of Salvadoran immigrants into America's most feared gang. His name is César Humberto López Larios, but on the streets they call him El Greñas. From his early days as a refugee in Los Angeles to his rise as a founding leader of MS-13's Ranfla Nacional, the gang's ruling council El Greñas became more than just a gangster. He was a strategist, a shot caller, and one of the masterminds who turned MS-13 into a global criminal force. This isn't just the story of a man. This is the story of how El Greñas helped create the monster we know today as MS-13. Stay tuned, because once you step inside his world, you'll see why El Greñas is remembered not just as a gang member, but as one of the founders of America's most dangerous gang. The story of César Humberto López Larios, better known as El Greñas, begins long before his name carried fear across 2 continents. His journey is tied to the violent history of El Salvador, a country torn apart by one of the bloodiest civil wars in Latin America. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, El Salvador was a land of broken families and shattered communities. The government, backed by military power, clashed with leftist guerrilla movements, and the streets turned into battlegrounds. For children growing up during that time, survival meant adapting to violence at a young age. El Greñas was one of those children. Like thousands of others, he witnessed killings, disappearances, and brutality that scarred him and hardened his view of the world. When his family, like many Salvadorans, fled the chaos and migrated north to the United States, they carried those scars with them. The neighborhoods of Los Angeles where they landed were already divided by racial lines and plagued by gang rivalries. Mexican-American gangs dominated many areas, and newcomers, especially young Central American refugees, were often caught in the crossfire or treated as outsiders. For teenagers like El Greñas, the streets were not just a place to hang out, but a battlefield where respect and survival depended on showing strength. It was in this environment that El Greñas and others like him began to form tight-knit groups for protection. These weren't the highly organized gangs that MS-13 would later become known as, but more like brotherhoods of young men who felt they had nowhere else to belong. They bonded over music, drugs, and survival. But most importantly, they shared the trauma of being Salvadoran outsiders in Los Angeles. They carried with them the lessons of violence they had absorbed during their childhoods in El Salvador. These lessons became the foundation of their group identity. El Greñas quickly stood out. His nickname, which referred to his long, messy hair, became known in local neighborhoods, and his reputation for toughness and loyalty grew. He wasn't the loudest or the most flamboyant, but he had presence, the kind of presence that draws others in and commands respect. In a world where violence determined status, El Greñas showed he was unafraid to fight and willing to defend his own. This made him a natural leader among the Salvadoran youth in Los Angeles. The group eventually adopted the name Mara Salvatrucha, combining the word Mara, a Central American slang term for gang, with Salvatrucha, a nickname for Salvadorans known for being street-smart and battle-hardened. While many gangs in Los Angeles were tied to specific neighborhoods or ethnic backgrounds, Mara Salvatrucha's identity was uniquely shaped by the refugee experience. They were a gang of survivors, men forged in war and sharpened in exile. El Greñas, along with other early figures, helped shape not just the gang structure, but its culture. Tattoos, hand signs, and rituals of initiation became symbols of belonging, and violence became a language that everyone understood. Life in Los Angeles during the 1980s was unforgiving. Police were cracking down on gangs, and the streets were flooded with drugs, especially crack cocaine. For young men with limited opportunities, the gang offered a form of family and income. El Greñas and his peers learned to navigate this harsh environment by being more ruthless than their enemies. They carried knives, machetes, and eventually guns, leaving a trail of fear wherever they went. Other gangs began to take notice. Mara Salvatrucha wasn't just another group of Salvadoran kids anymore. They were becoming a force to be reckoned with. What truly distinguished El Greñas and his crew was their willingness to use extreme violence. Stories began to spread of machete attacks and brutal beatings that left victims disfigured or dead. This reputation helped the gang gain power quickly. They weren't the largest gang in Los Angeles, but they were one of the most feared. For El Greñas, fear was power, and power was survival. The lessons of El Salvador's Civil War were playing out on the streets of Los Angeles, and he was among the men shaping how MS-13 would operate for decades to come. But Los Angeles was only the beginning. The United States government, facing rising gang violence, began deporting thousands of immigrants with criminal records. Many of them, including members of MS-13, were sent back to El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala. For El Greñas and others, this meant returning to countries still recovering from civil wars, countries with weak governments and fragile institutions. Deportation didn't stop the gang, it spread it. Suddenly, Mississippi 13 wasn't just a Los Angeles problem anymore. It was becoming a transnational organization. Back in Central America, El Greñas' reputation continued to grow. He was no longer just the scrappy immigrant kid from Los Angeles. He was now recognized as one of the gang's original leaders. His involvement in the formation of what would later be known as the Ranfla Nacional, the national ruling council of MS-13, solidified his status. This council was responsible for coordinating the gang's activities across borders, making decisions about alliances, punishments, and strategies. While law enforcement saw them as criminals, within the gang, they were regarded as visionaries, men who had turned a group of desperate refugees into a global criminal brand. The life of El Greñas was not one of luxury or fame. Unlike cartel bosses who flaunted wealth, Mississippi, 13 leaders often operated in the shadows, blending into the communities they controlled. But his power was undeniable. When he spoke, others listened. When he gave orders, they were carried out. Whether in Los Angeles or El Salvador, his influence reached far, shaping how MS-13 operated on the ground. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, Mississippi, 13 had become a household name in the United States. Media reports painted them as monsters. Politicians used their image to push for tougher immigration laws, and law enforcement made them a priority. But behind the headlines and political debates, men like El Greñas continued to quietly pull the strings. They controlled the flow of violence, dictated the rules inside prisons, and decided the fate of those who crossed them. What made El Greñas unique was that his power didn't just come from fear. It came from the loyalty of his followers. He was respected as one of the original founders, someone who had lived the same struggles and fought the same battles as the men he led. For younger members of MS-13, his name carried weight. He wasn't just a leader. He was a symbol of the gang's origins, a reminder of where they came from and why they existed. As law enforcement on both sides of the border increased pressure, El Greñas and other leaders adapted. They became more organized, more secretive, and more strategic. Meetings were held in prisons, messages were passed through coded letters, and decisions were made collectively by the Ranfla Nacional. This wasn't the chaotic street gang of the early days anymore. It was a criminal network with a chain of command, discipline, and reach across countries. And El Greñas was one of the men sitting at the top. The legacy of El Greñas begins with his childhood in a war-torn country, carries through his survival in the violent streets of Los Angeles, and culminates in his role as a founder of one of the most feared gangs in the world. His story is not just about one man, but about the forces of history, migration, and violence that shaped him. It is about how trauma and survival instincts can create leaders who thrive in chaos. And it is about how a boy from El Salvador, known only for his messy hair and street toughness, became El Greñas, the man who helped create the monster we now know as MS-13. When César Humberto López Larios, El Greñas, returned to Central America after deportation, he found himself in a country that looked nothing like the one he had fled years before. El Salvador was scarred by its civil war, the streets patrolled by soldiers and police, but beneath the surface, the institutions were fragile and the wounds of war still wide open. For men like him, the chaos was not an obstacle, it was an opportunity. What had been born on the streets of Los Angeles was now ready to grow in the soil of El Salvador, where poverty, corruption, and weak law enforcement created the perfect breeding ground for gangs. El Greñas was not just another deported gangster trying to survive. He carried with him the experience of organizing in Los Angeles, the lessons of battling rival gangs, and the reputation of being one of the originals. In the world of gangs, respect was everything, and his history gave him an authority that few could challenge. Almost immediately, he became part of the conversations that would shape the future of MS-13 in El Salvador. Those conversations led to the formation of the Ranfla Nacional, the gang's high council made up of its most senior leaders who would dictate policy, strategy, and punishment across borders. Inside the prisons of El Salvador, where many gang leaders were concentrated, the Ranfla Nacional emerged as the true power. Politicians could pass laws and police could launch raids, but behind the bars, the real orders were being given by men like El Greñas. He understood that control of the prisons meant control of the streets. Soldiers and police could arrest as many low-level members as they wanted, but the gang only grew stronger inside. Every new arrest meant more recruits, more loyalty, and more reach. Prisons became universities of crime, and El Greñas was one of the professors writing the curriculum. His role in the Ranfla was not about flashy violence or personal fame. He was a strategist, someone who understood that the gang needed order if it was going to survive the pressure of governments and rival groups. Under his influence, Mississippi 13 became less about random acts of violence and more about discipline. Murders were ordered strategically, extortion was managed like a business, and the gang began to act like an organization with rules and hierarchy. Those who broke the rules faced brutal punishment, often torture and execution, carried out without hesitation. One of the most significant shifts during El Greñas' time in leadership was the expansion of MS-13 beyond street corners and neighborhoods. The gang began reaching into politics and society itself. In El Salvador, where poverty was rampant and trust in government low, Mississippi 13 became a shadow authority. They controlled entire communities, taxing local businesses, dictating who could enter or leave certain areas, and even resolving disputes. For many people, the gang had more influence in daily life than the government. El Greñas and the Ranfla Nacional understood that this control was power, and it gave them leverage far beyond the streets. This leverage became clear in the early 2010s when evidence surfaced of negotiations between the Salvadoran government and MS-13 leaders. Facing skyrocketing homicide rates, politicians sought truces with the gangs, hoping to reduce violence in exchange for benefits. While officials denied some of these deals, testimonies and investigations later revealed that the Ranfla Nacional had indeed been approached. El Greñas was among those suspected of playing a role in these backroom negotiations. For the first time, the founders of MS-13 were not just gangsters, but political actors, able to bend national policy to their will. Yet power brought more attention. Law enforcement in both El Salvador and the United States recognized the importance of figures like El Greñas. In 2021, U.S. prosecutors unsealed indictments against several MS-13 leaders, charging them with terrorism and crimes that extended far beyond simple gang violence. The inclusion of El Greñas' name in these cases confirmed what many had suspected for years. He was not just a neighborhood gangster, but one of the architects of an international criminal network. Even in prison, his influence continued to spread. Through coded messages, visits, and loyal intermediaries, El Greñas maintained communication with lieutenants on the outside. Orders from the Ranfla were carried out without question. Murders were approved, truces negotiated, and money flowed in and out of prison walls. The Salvadoran state tried to isolate leaders with high security facilities, but the network they had built was too strong to be broken by bars and guards. The loyalty he commanded came from more than fear. To many younger MS-13 members, Elgrenas was living proof of the gang's mythology. He had been there at the beginning, had fought on the streets of Los Angeles, and had survived deportation, prison, and political battles. His messy hair and hardened face were symbols of authenticity. When he spoke, he wasn't just giving orders. He was passing down the legacy of the gang itself. In a world where betrayal and mistrust were constant, his history gave him credibility that no amount of violence could buy. But leadership also meant enemies. Rivals inside the gang vied for influence, and government agencies on both sides of the border worked tirelessly to dismantle the Ranfla. Informants were flipped, safe houses raided, and financial networks targeted. Yet, despite the pressure, Mississippi 13 endured. It adapted to new challenges, spread into new territories, and maintained its reputation as one of the most dangerous gangs in the world. Through it all, Elgrenas remained a constant presence, his name whispered in courtrooms, police briefings, and gang meetings alike. His story also reflects the transformation of MS-13 itself. What began as a survival group for Salvadoran refugees in Los Angeles became a multinational criminal syndicate. Extortion, drug trafficking, human smuggling, and contract killings became part of its operations. And at the center of that transformation were men like Elgrenas, who understood that survival required more than violence. It required structure, discipline, and vision. By the time international attention focused on the Ranfla Nacional, Elgrenas had already left an indelible mark on the gang. His fingerprints were on its rules, its rituals, its business models, and its political strategies. The machetes and tattoos that symbolized the gang's brutality were only part of the story. The real power came from the men who sat in prison cells, thinking 3 moves ahead, orchestrating chaos like chess masters in the shadows. Elgrenas' rise inside the Ranfla was not about charisma or wealth, but about consistency. He had survived when many others had fallen, and survival in the gang world is its own kind of currency. Every year he lived, every challenge he overcame added to his legend. Younger members looked at him not just as a leader, but as a survivor who embodied the very spirit of MS-13. His role in the Ranfla Nacional marked the peak of his influence. While governments debated how to dismantle the gang and law enforcement scrambled to keep up with its transnational operations, Elgrenas and his peers continued to dictate terms. They reminded the world that MS-13 was not a loose band of thugs, but a structured organization with leadership, vision, and endurance. And as long as men like him existed, the gang would not disappear, it would evolve. The rise of Elgrenas is more than just the tale of a gangster gaining power. It is the story of how trauma, migration, and survival can create leaders in the underworld. It is the story of how a boy shaped by war became a man who shaped a criminal empire. And it is the story of how the Ranfla Nacional, with Elgrenas as one of its guiding forces, turned MS-13 from a local gang into one of the most feared organizations in the world. By the time the world began to pay close attention to the leaders of MS-13, César Humberto López Larios Elgrenas was already deep in the machinery of power. He was no longer simply a figure from the gang's violent origin story in Los Angeles, nor just another deportee trying to reclaim territory in El Salvador. He had become part of the inner circle of the Ranfla Nacional, a council that operated almost like a shadow government. From behind prison walls, he and his peers held the ability to command thousands of men, dictate the rhythms of violence, and even influence the course of Salvadoran politics. This was no small feat. Politicians held speeches, police patrolled streets, and judges handed down sentences. But in the poorest neighborhoods where the state was absent, Mississippi 13 held real authority. For El Greñas, politics was never about ideology or speeches. It was about leverage. Violence was the language, and fear was the currency. By the early 2010s, El Salvador was drowning in blood. Homicide rates were among the highest in the world, and the government struggled to contain the chaos. It was at this moment that reports of secret negotiations between politicians and the gang began to emerge. The idea was simple, but controversial. In exchange for reduced killings, gang leaders like El Greñas would receive benefits, looser prison conditions, access to cell phones, money, and even influence in local elections. For the government, it was a desperate attempt to bring down homicide rates. For MS-13, it was an opportunity to expand their power from the shadows into the realm of politics. Inside the prisons, these negotiations gave the Ranfla Nacional an even stronger position. If the government was willing to sit at the table, it meant the gang had something that the state itself could not control. El Greñas and his peers now had proof that their organization wasn't just feared by communities and rival gangs, it was respected, or at least acknowledged, by those in power. It was a turning point that showed how far the gang had come since its early days as a survival group in Los Angeles. The boy with messy hair, once mocked for being an immigrant outsider, was now part of a council dictating the fate of an entire nation. But such deals came with risks. Rumors of truces spread quickly, and when they surfaced publicly, outrage followed. Many Salvadorans saw the government as weak, negotiating with criminals instead of protecting its people. Others saw the gangs as too powerful, able to bend politicians to their will. For law enforcement agencies in the United States, it was confirmation of what they had long feared, that MS-13 was no longer just a gang terrorizing neighborhoods, but a political actor capable of shaping national policies. The Ranfla Nacional, with El Greñas among its senior voices, had crossed a line from criminality into something closer to insurgency. 8. In the years that followed, pressure on El Greñas grew. U.S. agencies, particularly the FBI and the Department of Justice, began to see MS-13 not just as a domestic crime issue, but as an international security threat. Prosecutors started framing their cases with new language, not gang violence, but terrorism. The indictments against El Greñas and other top leaders included charges of material support for terrorism, conspiracy to commit acts of terror, and crimes intended to intimidate governments. This wasn't just about murders and extortion anymore. It was about labeling MS-13 a political enemy of the United States. For a man who had once fought street battles in Los Angeles, it was surreal but real. He was now officially an enemy in the eyes of a superpower. Even as U.S. indictments stacked up, El Greñas continued to command loyalty inside El Salvador. The prisons, packed with thousands of gang members, became his base of operations. Messages were smuggled in and out, decisions delivered through trusted intermediaries, and orders carried out with precision. For those outside the gang, it was baffling how could men behind bars still dictate so much violence on the streets. But for those inside the structure, it made perfect sense. The Ranfla Nacional had established itself as the brain of the organization. If the soldiers on the streets were the arms and the money from extortion and smuggling was the lifeblood, then the leaders in prison were the mind. Without them, the body would stumble. With them, it moved like a predator. El Greñas' involvement in these systems made him a high-value target. The United States pressured El Salvador to tighten prison controls, to cut communication, to isolate leaders. But each measure had limits. Corruption ran deep, guards could be bribed, and in some cases, officials themselves relied on gang influence to maintain order. Every attempt to box in the Ranfla Nacional only seemed to prove how entrenched they had become. When violence surged, they could unleash more bloodshed. When violence dipped, politicians took credit, while the gang quietly reaped benefits. El Greñas, once a boy who sought protection in the streets of Los Angeles, was now wielding violence as a bargaining chip against governments. To understand his role in this era, one must imagine the dual lives he lived. On one side, he was a prisoner, confined to walls and gates, dressed in the same clothes as any other inmate. On the other, he was a decision-maker whose words carried the power of life and death across borders. He could approve the execution of a rival, authorize the extortion of a business, or halt violence in a community if it served a strategic purpose. Few political leaders in El Salvador wielded such direct and immediate power, and for law enforcement, this made him one of the most dangerous men alive. The United States' focus on El Greñas intensified in 2020 and 2021 when prosecutors began unsealing indictments naming him specifically as part of MS-13's core leadership. These documents described him as not only a gang leader, but a terrorist, responsible for ordering killings and managing transnational criminal activities. For the U.S., putting men like El Greñas on trial was about more than justice. It was about sending a message that MS-13 could not operate as a state within a state. But extraditing him would not be simple. El Salvador, under President Nayib Bukele, was already in a complicated relationship with the gang. On one hand, Bukele declared war on MS-13, filling prisons with thousands of members and rolling out states of emergency. On the other, critics accused his government of cutting secret deals with gang leaders to keep homicide rates low. In this murky political landscape, El Greñas became both a symbol and a pawn. For the gang itself, his continued survival and leadership reinforced the myth of invincibility. He had faced deportation, imprisonment, political storms, and international charges, yet he remained at the core of the Ranfla Nacional. In the culture of MS-13, this endurance was the ultimate credential. Younger members revered him, not just as a founder, but as proof that one could survive the system and still hold power. For rivals, his name was a reminder that the gang was more than tattoos and street violence. It was a machine with deep roots and steady leadership. As the years went on, El Greñas' story became entangled with the larger story of MS-13 itself. The gang was no longer confined to the barrios of Los Angeles or the slums of San Salvador. It had spread into Guatemala, Honduras, Mexico, and even back into U.S. cities far from its original home. Each branch carried out extortion, smuggling, and murder, but all deferred to the authority of the Ranfla. The fact that men like El Greñas could still command from prison showed how resilient the structure had become. Law enforcement could arrest soldiers, deport members, and raid safe houses, But as long as the brain survived, the body would regenerate. The image of El Greñas sitting in a prison cell while being named in international indictments captures the paradox of his power. On paper, he was a prisoner, stripped of freedom, a man the state had confined. In reality, he was a strategist, a founder, a leader whose influence stretched across borders. The walls around him were physical, but his authority extended beyond them, carried by loyalty, fear, and the brutal discipline of MS-13. For governments, this was the nightmare that a man they had locked away could still dictate violence in their streets. In many ways, Chapter 3 of El Greñas' life is the story of MS-13's evolution from street gang to political force. His fingerprints are on the truces, the negotiations, the terror charges, and the continued survival of the gang despite global efforts to destroy it. To law enforcement, he is a terrorist. To his followers, he is a founder. To his enemies, he is a ghost who cannot be erased. And to history, he is the messy-haired boy who became one of the architects of America's most dangerous gang. At the height of his power, César Humberto López Larios El Greñas was no longer just a survivor of the streets, or even just a founding father of MS-13. He had become a figure whose name carried both reverence and terror across borders. Though he spent much of these years inside prison walls, his reach extended far beyond the bars. From dimly lit cells in El Salvador, he dictated the fate of men and communities, and the echoes of his commands reached Los Angeles, Houston, New York, and countless barrios in Central America. His peak years were not defined by personal wealth or luxury, but by the ability to wield life and death like a weapon, to command loyalty through fear, and to ensure that his gang not only survived, but thrived under impossible pressure. The orders of El Greñas were rarely written down. Communication traveled through layers of trusted couriers, coded messages hidden in scraps of paper, or whispered during family visits. But even when the message was vague, everyone understood the weight behind it. A single nod or phrase could mean the difference between a community spared or a community engulfed in bloodshed. His voice carried such authority that entire cells of MS-13 members outside prison would wait for his approval before carrying out major actions. This kind of control was not earned overnight. It was the product of years of surviving, fighting, and building trust within the gang. During this period, extortion became one of the main engines of MS-13's survival. Small businesses, bus drivers, market vendors, anyone who tried to make an honest living in the neighborhoods controlled by the gang was forced to pay la renta. It was not just a tax, it was a declaration of control. Those who paid were allowed to work in peace. Those who resisted were met with swift and brutal consequences. Many of these decisions, particularly when disputes or escalations arose, flowed back to the Ranfla Nacional, where El Greñas and other leaders weighed in. Killings were not random. They were calculated, meant to enforce discipline and remind everyone that resistance was futile. This brutal system of order extended even within the gang itself. Loyalty was absolute, and betrayal was unthinkable. Any sign of disobedience or softness was dealt with through punishment that often ended in death. El Greñas was instrumental in maintaining this iron discipline. Stories circulated of how he approved executions of members who had stolen money, cooperated with police, or failed to carry out orders. These were not isolated acts of cruelty, but deliberate strategies to instill fear and maintain cohesion. For him, survival of the gang depended on ruthless enforcement of rules. Every member knew that loyalty was their only shield, and crossing El Greñas's word was a death sentence. Beyond extortion and internal discipline, Mississippi, 13 under his influence, expanded deeper into drug trafficking and human smuggling. While the gang was never as dominant in the cocaine trade as Mexican cartels, it positioned itself as an indispensable link in local distribution chains. In border areas, Mississippi, 13 facilitated the smuggling of migrants heading north, charging fees and often using violence to control routes. These activities brought in money, but more importantly, they expanded the gang's influence beyond neighborhoods into international criminal markets. Behind prison walls, El Greñas and his peers oversaw these operations with a vision that was far more organized than the chaotic violence of the early years. The impact of his leadership was felt most strongly in communities under MS-13 control. Entire neighborhoods lived in the shadow of the gang's authority. Residents could not move freely without permission. Curfews were enforced not by police, but by gang members. Even local celebrations and funerals required the gang's blessing. For many families, the face of power was not the mayor or a police officer, but a tattooed teenager carrying out orders that trace back to men like El Greñas. In this way, his authority was invisible but absolute, shaping the daily lives of thousands of people who would never see his face. During these peak years, the gang also weaponized fear as a psychological tool. The brutality of its killings was often exaggerated, not just for efficiency, but for effect. Victims were mutilated, bodies left in public places, messages carved into skin or painted on walls. The intention was always the same: to send a signal that MS-13 was untouchable. While local cliques carried out the acts, the philosophy behind them came from the top. El Greñas and the Ranfla Nacional understood that fear traveled faster than bullets. A single gruesome murder could silence an entire community. This philosophy became a defining characteristic of MS-13 and one of the reasons it stood apart from other gangs. Yet, even as law enforcement closed in, even as prisons tightened restrictions, El Greñas' authority grew. He had survived long enough to become a symbol, and in gang culture, symbols carry immense power. For younger members who only knew his name through whispers, he was almost a mythical figure, the messy-haired founder who had seen it all, fought it all, and still stood at the top. For rivals, his name was enough to deter defiance. For governments, he was the face of a problem they could not seem to crush. The Salvadoran state's attempts to crack down often backfired. Mass arrests filled prisons to overflowing, but this only concentrated MS-13's leadership further inside the walls. Policies meant to weaken the gang instead gave El Greñas a captive audience of recruits. Inside, he could indoctrinate new members, test their loyalty, and prepare them for life on the outside. Each crackdown fed the machine. Politicians boasted of victory. But on the ground, the gang's grip tightened. By this time, Mississippi, 13 had established itself firmly in the imagination of the world as a symbol of uncontrollable violence. News outlets splashed stories of machete murders, tattooed faces, and horrific crimes. But behind the headlines, figures like El Greñas quietly managed the machinery. ensuring that the gang remained cohesive and feared. It was not about being in the spotlight, it was about pulling the strings in the dark. One of the most striking aspects of his peak power was how he managed to turn prison into a throne. Most men fear being locked away, cut off from freedom. For Greñas, prison was a tool. It gave him legitimacy, placed him among his soldiers, and kept him insulated from direct attacks. Within those walls, he was untouchable, guarded not just by bars, but by the loyalty of thousands. He turned the place meant to contain him into the very heart of his empire. The U.S. indictments and international attention only fueled his legend. Being named in documents as a terrorist, as one of the most dangerous men alive, did not weaken his image among MS-13, it elevated it. In the twisted logic of the gang world, the more powerful the enemy, the greater the leader who stood against them. For younger recruits, the fact that the United States saw him as a threat only proved his stature. He wasn't just a Salvadoran gangster anymore. He was an international figure, feared by governments and revered by his own. At his peak, Greñas embodied the contradictions of MS-13. He lived in confinement, but commanded freedom of action. He was faceless to the world, yet omnipresent in its fears. He was despised by governments, yet courted by politicians seeking peace. He was a criminal, but in the eyes of his followers, he was also a founder, a strategist, and a legend. His messy hair, once a nickname, had become a symbol of defiance against a world that tried and failed to contain him. The peak years of his reign showed not only the brutality of MS-13, but its adaptability. Under his watch, the gang proved that it was not a passing threat, but a permanent force. It rooted itself in communities, infiltrated politics, and survived every wave of crackdowns. And at the center of that survival was Greñas, the founder who turned trauma into strategy and fear into power. His legacy during these years is written in the silence of extorted markets, in the fear of bus drivers paying their daily rent, in the headlines of international newspapers, and in the unmarked graves of those who defied him. He did not need to shout to be heard. His power was measured not in riches, but in obedience, not in visibility, but in shadow. And though the world could not always see him, the world could always feel him in the blood, in the fear, and in the persistence of MS-13. The story of César Humberto López Larios Greñas was not destined to end in triumph. For years, he had sat at the very heart of MS-13's machine, commanding fear and loyalty, shaping the gang's evolution from a street crew to a transnational criminal network. But no empire lasts forever. As governments turned their gaze toward him, as rival forces grew impatient, and as the internal pressures of running a violent brotherhood mounted, cracks began to form in the image of untouchable power he had built. The fall of Greñas was not sudden, it was slow, dragged out, and defined by betrayal, international pursuit, and the weight of a legend too heavy for even him to carry. By the early 2010s, Mississippi, 13 was no longer an underground problem that could be ignored. In the United States, law enforcement painted the gang as a national security threat. Politicians seeking to capitalize on public fear pointed to the machete murders and extortion networks as proof of lawlessness bleeding across the border. In El Salvador, the government declared all-out war, filling prisons to capacity and staging massive operations against the gang. For the first time, Greñas and his fellow Ranfla Nacional leaders were not just criminals. They were being framed as terrorists. The indictments came swiftly. U.S. federal prosecutors unsealed charges that named Greñas as one of the most dangerous men in the hemisphere. They accused him of directing murders, drug trafficking, and extortion, not only in El Salvador but across American soil. The words were heavy: conspiracy to commit terrorism, racketeering, murder for hire. To many on the outside, these documents read like the final chapter of a notorious gangster. But inside the cells, among MS-13 soldiers, they sounded like medals of honor. Being named an enemy of the United States was not shameful. It was proof of power. Still, the indictments had practical consequences. International cooperation tightened. Surveillance increased. Governments, once hesitant to share intelligence, began pooling resources to track MS-13's leadership. For Greñas, this meant less room to maneuver. Visits became more restricted. Messages carried out of prison faced stricter monitoring. Informants began to appear, sometimes within his own network. The same prison that once served as his throne began to feel more like a trap. Inside the gang, whispers of discontent grew. Some cliques resented the top-heavy leadership, blaming the Ranfla Nacional for demanding too much while living protected behind bars. Younger leaders sought more autonomy, eager to prove themselves without waiting for approval from Greñas or his peers. While none openly defied him, the unity that had defined his peak began to fray. Every missed payment, every failed order, every rumor of betrayal chipped away at the image of absolute control. For a gang built on fear and loyalty, such cracks were dangerous. The Salvadoran government intensified its strategy by isolating top leaders in maximum security prisons. Greñas was transferred to harsher conditions, cut off from many of his previous privileges. No more free movement inside the walls, no more open meetings, no more access to contraband phones. Guards monitored his every move, determined to sever the invisible lines of communication he had relied on for years. To the authorities, this was a victory. To Greñas, it was a war of attrition. He still had soldiers, still had ways to send messages, but the ease with which he once ruled was gone. Each order carried the risk of exposure. Each message had to pass through layers of loyalists, any of whom might be tempted to betray him for survival. Meanwhile, the political climate shifted. El Salvador experimented with controversial truces, negotiating with gang leaders in a desperate attempt to lower homicide rates. For a brief period, killings dropped, and MS-13 gained legitimacy by sitting at the table with politicians. But such truces were fragile, built on mistrust and hidden agendas. When the government reversed its stance and cracked down harder, Mississippi 13 was left exposed, painted as both manipulative and ruthless. And at the center of this storm was Greñas, accused of pulling the strings. The international spotlight grew hotter. The FBI placed him on lists of most wanted gang figures. Journalists sought to uncover his past, portraying him as the face of MS-13's evil. His messy hair, once just a nickname, became a symbol splashed across headlines. Greñas, the mastermind behind America's most feared gang. Yet, for all the attention, his physical world shrank. Locked in concrete, watched constantly, he became both infamous and invisible. His name traveled further than he ever could. It was during this decline that betrayal struck deepest. Informants from within the gang began cooperating with U.S. authorities, providing details of how orders were transmitted, how money was laundered, how killings were approved. Some of these informants were men who had once sworn loyalty to El Greñas. To him, this was the ultimate insult, the collapse of the very code that had sustained the gang. Where loyalty once meant survival, now survival meant betrayal. His empire was rotting from within, and there was little he could do to stop it. The final years of his power were marked by frustration and paranoia. Every guard might be listening. Every visitor might be carrying a hidden recorder. Every soldier might be tempted to switch sides. For a man who had once commanded fear effortlessly, the idea that his words could be twisted into evidence was suffocating. The weight of the U.S. indictments loomed over him. Extradition became a constant threat, and though he managed to delay it, the possibility hung in the air like a death sentence. Still, even in decline, his influence lingered. Soldiers on the street continued to invoke his name. For them, El Greñas was not just a leader, he was history itself, the living connection to the birth of MS-13. Even as his orders grew rarer and his communications more fragile, the myth of his authority kept him alive in the gang's culture. In graffiti scrawled across walls, in whispered conversations between new recruits, his name lived on. But myths cannot stop time. The combination of government pressure, internal betrayal, and the natural erosion of fear finally stripped him of the power he once held. Younger leaders emerged to take his place. The gang adapted, shifting tactics, experimenting with new structures. The founder, who had once defined their identity, became a prisoner, reduced to a symbol rather than an active commander. His messy hair, his defiant spirit, his reputation, they all remained. But the man himself was locked away, watching his empire evolve without him. The fall of El Greñas was not dramatic. There was no final shootout, no cinematic escape, no sudden betrayal in the dead of night. It was quieter, more suffocating. It was the slow realization that the world had caught up to him, that no man could outrun the weight of his own legend. For decades, he had lived in the shadows, controlling through fear and loyalty. Now, the shadows closed in, leaving him isolated, remembered, but powerless. Yet, in a strange way of gang lore, even his downfall fed the myth. To outsiders, he was just another criminal brought low by justice. But to many inside MS-13, he was proof of their endurance. If even the founder could not be erased, if his name still carried weight after isolation and betrayal, then the gang itself was immortal. El Greñas became less a man and more a ghost, a symbol haunting the cells and streets where MS-13 continued to thrive. His story did not end with redemption or regret. It ended with the quiet persistence of a man who had once commanded nations' fear, now left to confront his own mortality behind bars. But his legacy, for better or worse, lived on. In every extorted marketplace, in every whispered threat, in every recruit eager to prove himself, the shadow of El Greñas stretched forward. His fall did not end MS-13. It only transformed him into part of the myth that would keep the gang alive long after he was gone. Even as the man himself sat locked away in a cell, El Greñas' shadow stretched across borders. For MS-13, the founder's name had become more than a person. It was a myth, a story passed from one generation of soldiers to the next. In the neighborhoods where the gang held power, new recruits still whispered his name with reverence, even if they had never seen his face. His messy hair, the reason for his street name, had taken on an almost symbolic meaning. representing defiance, survival, and the refusal to bow to authority. Though stripped of his ability to command directly, El Greñas continued to rule in silence, his legend doing the work his voice no longer could. The gang that El Greñas helped shape did not collapse when his power waned. Instead, it adapted. Younger leaders filled the vacuum, men who had grown up under his authority and absorbed his philosophy. These new shot callers carried his lessons forward: loyalty above all else, fear as a weapon, violence as communication, and survival as the ultimate goal. They did not have his history nor his status as a founder, but they inherited his structure. In this way, El Greñas' fingerprints remained on every decision the gang made, even if his own words never left his prison walls. The international spotlight that had once centered on him now spread across the organization. MS-13 continued to dominate headlines, blamed for machete attacks in suburban American towns, mass killings in El Salvador, and smuggling networks stretching from Honduras to Mexico. Law enforcement declared victory every time a leader was captured or extradited, but the cycle repeated itself. One man fell, another rose. For outsiders, it seemed endless. For insiders, it was the proof of what El Greñas had built, a system strong enough to survive the fall of individuals, even its founders. What made his legacy particularly enduring was the myth-making within the gang itself. Stories of El Greñas were told and retold, exaggerated, polished, and passed down like folklore. Some claimed he had outsmarted entire governments from behind bars. Others said he could predict betrayal before it happened. A few even spoke of him as if he were untouchable, immune to bullets or prison walls. The reality of his decline did not matter. What mattered was the image, and in the gang's culture, image was more powerful than truth. A soldier who believed in the ghost of El Greñas fought harder, killed without hesitation, and remained loyal even when fear of death alone was not enough. At the same time, the governments of the United States and El Salvador made him into a symbol of their own. He was not just a criminal, but an example, a warning, a face they could point to when arguing for harsher laws and bigger budgets. His name appeared in speeches, indictments, and headlines, reinforcing the idea that MS-13 was not just a local gang, but an international menace. Ironically, every attempt to demonize him only cemented his place in history. By painting him as one of the world's most dangerous men, authorities fed the very myth they wanted to destroy. Meanwhile, inside prison, El Greñas aged. Years of confinement weighed on him. He no longer had the energy of a young gangster fighting for survival in Los Angeles streets. The battles of his youth had been replaced by endless days under fluorescent lights, the monotony of lockup, and the constant presence of guards who treated him as both a trophy and a threat. Yet even here, even as time wore him down, he refused to break. His silence, his refusal to cooperate, his endurance in the face of isolation, these became his final acts of defiance. If he could not rule as before, he would rule through the example of survival. The newer generations of MS-13 leaders took inspiration from that defiance, but also diverged. They experimented with politics, infiltrating local governments, even negotiating secretly with presidents. They expanded business models, moving further into drug routes, cybercrime, and human trafficking. This evolution showed that the gang was no longer just a reflection of its founders. It had become something bigger, something self-sustaining. Still, When young leaders gathered to discuss strategy, they often invoked the lessons of the past, the principles instilled by Greñas and his generation. In this way, his voice was never absent, even if it was no longer audible. Communities under MS-13's grip felt his legacy most deeply. The extortion rackets, the curfews, the fear etched into daily life, these were his gifts to the gang. They were not accidents, but carefully designed systems of control that outlived him. Families continued to pay la renta. Bus drivers still feared missing a payment. Parents still prayed their children would not be recruited or targeted. These acts of submission, these constant reminders of power, were proof that the founder's blueprint had worked. He had created a gang that could rule neighborhoods like governments, and decades later, the structure remained intact. But while his legend was celebrated within the gang, outside it, his name was cursed. For families torn apart by MS-13's violence, Greñas was a monster. For law enforcement agents who had spent careers chasing shadows, he was the embodiment of frustration. For politicians, he was both a threat and a tool, invoked whenever fear needed to be stoked. The duality of his legacy was striking. Revered inside, reviled outside. Few men in history managed to exist so powerfully in both roles. As the years passed, the inevitability of time grew heavier. Prisoners whispered about his declining health, about the toll taken by endless confinement. Some speculated that death would finally erase his power, that once the founder was gone, the myth would fade. But others disagreed. In their view, his death would only make him stronger, freeing his legend from the frailty of his human body. Just as old mafia bosses became immortalized long after their deaths, Greñas was destined to become part of MS-13's eternal identity. In this sense, Chapter 6 of his story was less about the man and more about the transformation of his name into something immortal. The gang no longer needed his direct leadership. They carried him like a ghost, a silent partner in every act of violence, every extortion, every moment of defiance against the state. The messy-haired boy who had once fled war, survived Los Angeles streets, and built an empire of blood had transcended into myth. The irony of Greñas' journey was that in losing power, he gained immortality. Alive but silenced, confined but remembered, he became the perfect symbol for MS-13, a man who could be defeated physically but never erased spiritually. His story served as both inspiration and warning, a lesson carved into the history of the gang he helped create. Governments could lock him away, strip him of contact, and bury his voice under indictments. But they could never erase his name from the walls, tattoos, and whispered conversations that carried MS-13 into the future. For the world outside, the fall of Greñas might have seemed like justice. For the gang, it was a transformation. His body remained in a cell, but his spirit walked free in every street controlled by MS-13. And as long as the gang lived, so too would his legacy, messy-haired, defiant, ruthless, and eternal. The years after Greñas' silence were not years of peace. If anything, they were years that proved the truth of what he had built, an organization that did not need its founder to keep breathing. MS-13 was no longer a gang defined by a few men sitting at the top. It had become a living organism, a network of cells stretching across cities, states, and countries. Every barrio was a piece of its body, every clique a beating heart that kept the organism alive. El Grenas had planted the seed, but by the time he could no longer speak freely, the seed had grown into something vast and uncontrollable. In Los Angeles, the birthplace of the gang, the name of El Grenas carried a strange echo. For the older members, he was a memory, a man they had seen in the early days, the messy-haired leader who had stood shoulder to shoulder with them when survival was all that mattered. For younger members, he was a myth. They knew his name, but not his face, his legend, but not his voice. And yet, the myth was enough. When a soldier hesitated, when loyalty wavered, someone would remind them, "This is El Grenas' legacy. You're part of something bigger than yourself." In the world of gangs, myths often weigh more heavily than orders, and his myth was everywhere. In El Salvador, the government's war against MS-13 escalated. Mass arrests continued and prisons swelled with bodies. Politicians promised to crush the gang once and for all. Yet homicide rates rose and fell like waves, never truly disappearing. Each crackdown created martyrs. Each death reinforced the gang's belief that they were soldiers in an endless war. And in the background, El Grenas' name remained attached to the idea of defiance, the founder who had stared down governments and refused to break. Even as he aged, confined, and cut off, his story gave meaning to the lives of young men and women caught in the cycle of poverty and violence. The United States kept its focus sharp. Federal indictments painted MS-13 leaders as terrorists and the gang as a foreign enemy operating inside American borders. Politicians pointed to machete murders in quiet suburbs as proof of the gang's brutality, using MS-13 as a symbol in debates about immigration, security, and crime. For many Americans, El Grenas became a faceless bogeyman, the shadowy founder behind the headlines. Even if they never knew his real name, they knew the fear his gang inspired. The irony was unavoidable. While governments sought to erase his influence, they instead amplified his story, making him a legend beyond the neighborhoods he once ruled. Inside prison, El Grenas watched this unfold with the detachment of a man who knew he had already written his chapter. He was no longer the shot caller, no longer the one issuing commands that rippled through continents. But his silence did not erase him. Guards still whispered his name. Politicians still invoked him. Journalists still wrote about him. The world outside could not let him go. And so his myth remained alive. For a man who had once thrived in shadows, being remembered was the ultimate form of survival. What came next for MS-13 was an evolution he might never have imagined. Younger leaders pushed the gang into new arenas of power. Some sought alliances with Mexican cartels, leveraging MS-13's reach to gain access to drug corridors. Others experimented with politics, using intimidation and corruption to influence elections. The gang that began as protection for refugees in Los Angeles was now a player in international crime, feared in cities as far apart as Washington, San Salvador, and Tegucigalpa. This transformation was not just the work of new leaders, but the continuation of a foundation laid decades earlier. It was El Grenas' architecture, flexible, decentralized, and ruthless, that made survival possible. The people who lived under MS-13's shadow felt this continuity most sharply. To them, the founder's name was less important than the daily reality of extortion, curfews, and fear. Yet in conversations whispered in back alleys and on bus rides, his story surfaced. Parents warned their children about the path that led to men like him. Soldiers invoked his name as proof of loyalty. His legend bled into daily life, shaping choices, silencing resistance, and fueling the gang's mystique. Even outside the gang, criminologists, journalists, and investigators debated his legacy. Was El Greñas a mastermind, a man who deliberately built an empire from pain and poverty? Or was he simply a survivor, a product of circumstance who rode the wave of violence until it swallowed him whole? The truth was likely somewhere in between. He had vision enough to structure a gang that could outlast him, but he was also carried by forces larger than himself: migration, war, poverty, and the failures of governments. His story was not just about one man, but about the world that allowed men like him to rise. In the end, Chapter 7 of his story was not about his personal victories or defeats. It was about the persistence of his ghost. The messy-haired refugee who had once been just another teenager in Los Angeles had become a symbol stitched into the very DNA of MS-13. He was not present in every order, not behind every crime, not even active in the gang's new ventures, but he was there in spirit, an eternal reminder of where it all began. Governments could arrest leaders, exile cliques, and tighten borders, but they could not kill a myth. Myths live in the imagination, in the stories told by soldiers and whispered by civilians too afraid to resist. And for MS-13, El Greñas was no longer just a founder. He was their ghost king, watching from a cell, silently haunting the streets he once walked. The world outside saw him as a criminal in decline, a man trapped in a cage. But inside the gang, he was eternal. His legend would walk long after his body gave out. And as long as MS-13 continued to breathe, so too would the shadow of El Greñas, messy-haired, ruthless, and unforgettable. When El Greñas' voice finally faded from the corridors of prison, the silence was deafening. For decades, his presence, whether through whispered orders or the myth of his legend, had been a guiding shadow. Now, that shadow was less about a man and more about a ghost. MS-13 had become too vast to collapse with his absence, yet his disappearance from active leadership sparked questions across every level of the organization. Who would take up his mantle? Who would embody the ruthless spirit of survival that had defined him? In Los Angeles, the birthplace of MS-13, new faces rose quickly. Leaders who had once been lieutenants claimed higher ranks, each one invoking El Greñas' name to legitimize their authority. They didn't just inherit his legacy, they weaponized it. His name became a stamp of authenticity, proof that they were not just gangsters, but heirs to the founder's vision. Younger recruits, who had never met him, clung to his legend as a kind of spiritual compass. They believed that by following the path he had carved, they were walking in the footsteps of immortality. In El Salvador, however, the reality was harsher. The government, desperate to prove control, intensified its war on MS-13. Entire neighborhoods were militarized, with soldiers patrolling streets where children once played. Mass arrests tore fathers and brothers from families. But even as prisons overflowed, the gang adapted. Leaders inside cells continued to communicate, smuggling orders through coded notes, visits, and corrupt guards. The state could lock away bodies, but it couldn't silence the network. El Greñas had designed it that way: decentralized, resilient, able to survive decapitation. His absence only reinforced the brilliance of that design. The United States played its role with equal intensity. Politicians pointed to MS-13 as proof of unchecked immigration, as a symbol of chaos crossing borders. They paraded grisly crimes in front of cameras, using machete killings as political weapons. For them, Elgrenas was a faceless figurehead, the founder of a monster that now served as an easy talking point. But beneath the speeches and headlines, agents of the FBI, DEA, and ICE waged quiet wars. They infiltrated cliques, flipped informants, and tracked the money trails. And time and again, they found themselves chasing shadow structures designed to outlast any one man, even the founder himself. What Elgrenas left behind was not a static empire, but a fluid organism. In prisons, he had instilled the idea that leadership was not about one man, but about continuity. If a leader fell, another would rise. If a clique was dismantled, another would form. His genius, whether intentional or instinctive, was in building something that could survive the fall of its creator. By the time he vanished from active influence, Mississippi, 13 no longer needed him to function. It had become a culture, a way of life, a brand as recognizable as any corporation. And yet, his ghost lingered. Recruits in El Salvador were still told the story of the messy-haired refugee who had transformed fear into power. In Los Angeles, graffiti bearing the letters MS was sometimes accompanied by Greñas, as though invoking his name brought protection. Even in the United States courtroom where prosecutors condemned the gang, his name surfaced as the starting point of a story that refused to end. The man himself may have been silent, but his myth was louder than ever. But myths, like empires, have two sides. For the communities living under MS-13's shadow, Elgrenas' name was a curse. Mothers whose sons had been recruited against their will spat the name with bitterness. Priests working in gang-infested barrios spoke his name only as a warning, a reminder of how far their neighborhoods had fallen. Activists blamed him for generations lost to violence and poverty. To them, his legacy was not strength or resilience, it was tragedy, an endless cycle of funerals and fear. Outside the barrios, academics and journalists wrestled with his legacy. Was he truly a founder, or simply the most visible among a group of men who built MS-13 together? Was his brilliance exaggerated by the myth, or was he genuinely a criminal architect ahead of his time? Some argued that Elgrenas was less a mastermind and more a mirror of the world he inhabited, a refugee shaped by war, poverty, and neglect, who responded with violence because the world offered him nothing else. Others painted him as a ruthless strategist, a man who saw opportunity where others saw only chaos. The truth was impossible to pin down, but the debate itself kept his story alive. Meanwhile, Mississippi, 13 continued to evolve. Younger leaders pushed the gang into digital spaces using encrypted apps to coordinate extortion and trafficking. Others deepened ties with cartels, moving beyond street-level violence into transnational crime. And in each new move, the question lingered. What would Elgrenas think? His ghost was not passive. It was invoked in strategy sessions, in initiations, in moments of doubt. Even when silent, he guided them. The paradox was clear. The man himself, locked away in aging, had little real power left. But the story of the man, the founder, the myth, the messy-haired king of the streets was more powerful than any weapon. It was a story young men could cling to when they had nothing else, a story governments could not kill with arrests or bullets. In the barrios of Los Angeles, San Salvador, and beyond, The myth of El Grenas had become immortal. And so Chapter 8 was less about what El Grenas did and more about what he left behind. It was about the aftershocks of his existence, the way his legend continued to ripple long after his voice had been silenced. MS-13 was no longer just his creation. It was his inheritance to the world, a haunting reminder of how a refugee with messy hair and nothing to lose could spark one of the most feared movements in modern history. El Grenas had become a ghost, and MS-13 was his haunting. By the time El Grenas' influence faded into the background, Mississippi 13 was no longer just a gang bound by geography. It had become a global phenomenon, a brand recognized from the back alleys of San Salvador to the suburbs of Washington, D.C., and even as far as Spain and Australia. The seeds El Grenas and his fellow founders had planted decades earlier now bore strange and terrifying fruit across continents. The expansion was not random. It followed the pathways of migration, deportation, and desperation. Young men fleeing poverty in Central America carried the culture of MS-13 with them, sometimes as survivors trying to escape, other times as soldiers tasked with spreading influence. U.S. immigration policy, which deported convicted gang members back to El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala, became one of the most effective tools of expansion. Each deported member acted like a spark, igniting new cliques in neighborhoods that had never known the gang before. In Washington, D.C., Northern Virginia, and Maryland, the gang's presence grew sharply. Suburban high schools became recruiting grounds. Cafeterias and bus stops turned into battlefields of intimidation as cliques with names like Sailors Locos or Normandy Locos staked their claims. Parents and teachers who once thought gang violence was confined to distant barrios now found it creeping into their quiet neighborhoods. And behind it all was the same myth whispered in initiation rituals. This is the legacy of El Grenas and the founders. New York became another hub. Long Island, particularly Suffolk County, saw murders that carried the unmistakable signature of MS-13 machetes, brutality, and messages carved in flesh. Politicians seized on these crimes as proof of a foreign invasion. The media splashed headlines that painted the gang as an unstoppable force, and yet the reality was both more subtle and more chilling. MS-13 was never a centralized empire dictating every move, but rather a network of cliques connected by loyalty, fear, and myth. It was exactly the kind of decentralized design that El Grenas had envisioned from the beginning. Across the Atlantic, Spanish police reported sightings of MS-13 graffiti and arrests of members in Madrid. In Italy, whispers of Salvadoran cliques surfaced in immigrant-heavy neighborhoods. Even Australia reported small clusters of suspected MS-13 affiliates. The gang had become not just a Central American export, but a global brand one that young people, marginalized and forgotten, could adopt as their own. For many, it was less about direct orders from El Salvador and more about the allure of the name, the sense of belonging it promised. The legend of El Grenas made the identity transferable across oceans. Governments scrambled to respond. The U.S. poured billions into gang task forces, deportation programs, and community interventions. El Salvador, under new leadership, declared all-out war, filling prisons to the brim and parading shackled gang members before the media. Honduras and Guatemala followed similar paths. Yet even as thousands were arrested, Mississippi, 13's reach didn't shrink, it adapted. The myth that had begun with El Greñas gave the gang a resilience that institutions underestimated. Members believed they were part of something eternal, something bigger than themselves. To them, imprisonment or death was not the end, but a continuation of the story. Meanwhile, inside the prisons of El Salvador, the Ranfla, the ruling council, continued to exert influence. El Greñas had been among its architects, and though his personal role diminished, the structure endured. From behind bars, leaders smuggled orders through coded letters known as huaylas. These instructions coordinated extortion rackets, murders, and even political negotiations. The fact that entire governments were forced to negotiate with gang leaders showed just how deeply El Greñas' original blueprint had embedded itself in the DNA of MS-13. The international expansion also brought unexpected transformations. In some countries, Mississippi, 13 members became less of a dominating criminal force and more of a cultural identity. Tattoos of the number 13, hand signs, and graffiti became symbols of rebellion and belonging among immigrant youth who had never even been to El Salvador. The gang was no longer just a criminal organization. It was a transnational subculture. For law enforcement, this made the threat even harder to contain. How do you fight a ghost, a brand, a legend? Journalists tried to trace the roots of this expansion, and every path led back to the messy-haired refugee who had risen to power in the 1980s. Though El Greñas himself might never have stepped foot in Madrid or Washington, his story traveled faster than he ever could. His name was a chant in prison yards, a story told to new recruits, and a warning whispered in communities living under the gang's shadow. His legacy was no longer confined by borders. But the spread of MS-13 also created new vulnerabilities. Law enforcement began to share intelligence across borders, linking cliques in Los Angeles to murders in El Salvador and tracing money flows from extortion rackets in Virginia back to gang leaders imprisoned in San Salvador. International task forces formed, aiming to treat MS-13 not as a local street gang, but as a transnational criminal organization. The FBI placed leaders like Julian Adonai Arcaga Carrillas, El Porky, on its most wanted list, offering millions for their capture. In this global spotlight, El Greñas' name resurfaced not as a current actor, but as a historical figure, the man whose creation had now become the world's problem. For communities, though, the pain was local and immediate. Mothers in El Salvador wept for sons killed for refusing recruitment. Parents in New York begged for protection when their children were threatened in school hallways. Families in Honduras sent their children north, hoping to escape the very gang that awaited them on the other side of the border. The ghost of El Greñas stretched into their daily lives, a reminder that his legacy was not confined to history books, but lived on in their neighborhoods. In the end, the international expansion of MS-13 revealed the true brilliance and tragedy of El Greñas' vision. He had built something too resilient to destroy, too decentralized to control, and too mythologized to forget. His absence didn't weaken the gang, it strengthened the legend. MS-13 was no longer just a gang. It was a global story, a nightmare that traveled with migrants, with deportees, and with the desperate. And in every whispered initiation, in every spray-painted MS on a foreign wall, the ghost of El Greñas spoke. You cannot kill a myth. The story of César Humberto López Larios, El Greñas, is not just about one man or even one gang. It is about the conditions that gave birth to him, the war that displaced him, the poverty that hardened him, and the neglect that left entire generations searching for power in the only way they knew how. He was a refugee who became a founder, a prisoner who became a strategist, and finally, a ghost who outlived his own voice. Today, his fingerprints can still be seen on the streets of Los Angeles, in the prisons of El Salvador, and in the headlines of newspapers around the world. MS-13 has become more than a gang. It is a brand, a myth, a warning etched into the history of both Central America and the United States. And at the root of that myth stands El Greñas, the messy-haired refugee who built something too strong to die with him. Governments have tried to erase his legacy with mass arrests, militarized crackdowns, and political campaigns. They have filled prisons, sealed borders, and passed laws in his shadow. And yet, the gang persists not because of one man, but because of the systems he helped design and the legend that carries his name. His story proves a chilling truth. You can cage the body of a leader, but you cannot cage the myth. For communities living under MS-13's control, El Greñas is remembered as a curse, a wound that never healed. For gang members, his name is invoked like a prayer, a reminder that they are part of something eternal. For the world, he is both a symbol and a lesson of what happens when broken societies leave their children to fend for themselves, and how one man's hunger for survival can create a nightmare that crosses oceans. As the years pass, El Greñas will fade further into legend, his face becoming just another grainy photo in history's archives. But his story will not die. It will live on in whispered tales told to recruits, in graffiti sprayed on forgotten walls, and in the fear of families forced to navigate neighborhoods marked with the number 13. This is not the end of El Greñas' story. It is the beginning of a legacy that the world is still struggling to understand, still fighting to contain, and still haunted by. Because in the end, El Greñas did not just found a gang, he founded a ghost. And that ghost, known as MS-13, still walks among us.